Hello, Jessica. So glad you're here with me to talk about such important stuff.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Okay, so before we get started, I'll just tell people a little bit about you. Jessica Lahey is a recovering alcoholic of over 8 years. For 5 years, she worked as a teacher in an inpatient drug and alcohol recovery center for adolescents and has seen substance abuse disorder. Abuse?
No. Substance use disorder.
I know. All right, starting over.
Yeah, that's okay.
Jessica Lahey is a recovering alcoholic of over 8 years. For 5 years, she worked as a teacher in an inpatient drug and alcohol recovery center for adolescents and has seen substance use disorder from the inside as a parent and as a teacher. She writes about education, parenting, and child welfare for The Atlantic, The Washington Post, and The New York Times. Her most recent book, The Addiction Inoculation, addresses the roots of substance abuse, identifies who's most at risk for addiction, and offers parents and educators practical evidence-based steps for prevention. So been looking forward to this conversation. Thanks for living it and sharing it so openly and honestly and powerfully. That is what we need.
I think it's important. There's a part of it that's just, I think all people can benefit from being a little bit more honest about what's going on with them from a mental health perspective. And just because we find out that we have a lot of allies, that there are a lot of people who feel the same way, but also, as a white woman, it's easier for me. I go out there and I tell people that I'm an alcoholic and that I have, I have over 8 years of recovery, and people are like, oh, that's so brave, so wonderful. But there are a lot of people who just, when they say that they have a problem with drugs or alcohol, it's just another strike against them. And they don't get the hero talk. They get the, that makes you more of a risk for a job or an apartment or custody or whatever. So I think it's really important to normalize, recovery as much as possible.
Yeah. And that's what you're doing. So you've written that all children are at some risk for substance abuse, regardless of their genetics. According to the National Center on Addiction and Substance Abuse, teen drug addiction is the nation's largest preventable and costly health problem. Despite proven preventive strategies, 9 out of 10 adults with substance use disorder report that they began drinking and using drugs before 18. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, so that word preventable was such a big, all-expansive term. As a parent, so as soon as I got my drinking sort of in hand and was in recovery, immediately I started thinking about my kids, because I was raised by an alcoholic. One of my parents was raised by an alcoholic. There's alcoholism and drug use and abuse on my husband's side of the family. So we had known from the beginning that our kids were at elevated risk, but that term preventable, I needed to understand what that meant. I needed to know what that meant for my own kids. And I also wanted to understand what we could have done differently so that my kids, my kids, teachers do that all the time, my students in the rehab, how could we have prevented them from landing there? And it turns out that there's a lot of great evidence about this, especially as our understanding of the brain and brain development, we're able to do, in real-time imaging. But the other thing that's really interesting about this is, yes, 9 out of 10 people who have issues with substances in their adulthood admit that they started using before age 18, but it's even more interesting than that. If a kid starts using in 8th grade, for example, if they start initiating drugs and alcohol in 8th grade, they have over 50% chance of having substance use disorder during their lifetime. Whereas if we can get them to 18 or 21, statistically, the risk goes way, way down. So there are some, statistical issues there with causation and correlation and some other confounding factors. But for the most part, the message here is delay, delay, delay. The later it is that a kid starts using, if they start using, the lower their risk for lifelong risk of substance use disorder.
It's kind of mind-blowing when you think that what might seem as sort of a small tweak has such major implications, but it's not a small tweak. And especially in privilege, well, in all communities, there's this idea that parents share with one another, you know what, they're going to do it. They're just going to do it. I did it. I experimented. Kids are going to experiment, whether it's 8th grade or 9th grade or 10th grade. It doesn't make that much difference. So let's kind of get into the pragmatics of how that looks when your 8th grader is starting to sniff around, or you recognize that it's happening. You kind of hear the little buzz in the background of other parents talking.
Well, backing up, that whole attitude of, it's just a part of adolescence, everyone's going to do it, is part of the problem, because it's not true. Statistically speaking, for example, in 8th grade, only 25% of kids admit they've had more than a sip of alcohol by the end of 8th grade. On the other hand, some really strange things are happening. I was in Tennessee recently, and I was looking up the statistics for their particular county, and in their county, age of initiation for the average age of initiation for alcohol was 13.7 years, but average age of initiation for misuse of opiates was 13.5. So it used to be that we had this there was a theory that we had a predictable sort of quote gateway for substances. And that's, it's never actually been 100% true, but it's even less predictable now. And, the problem is that even if we know, and, the vast majority of parents seem to understand that if their kid is going to misuse prescription opiates, that means their first one they probably take is probably coming from someone's medicine cabinet, your own or someone else's. And yet only 10% of parents admit that they talk to their kids about misuse of prescription drugs. So there's a huge disconnect between reality and the actual numbers of who's using drugs and alcohol. And that's predictable because of this phenomenon called pluralistic ignorance. We tend to overestimate use, and not only the numbers of people that are using, but how much they use. And also the other problem with that is use and abuse tends to escalate in order to sort of meet that perceived norm, even when that perceived norm is overblown, which is just crazy. So it's self-perpetuating. And the problem is that part of preventing drug and alcohol use in kids is by giving them real information about, drug and alcohol use. So if in 8th grade, if a kid says, come on, it's no big deal, everybody uses it, but your kid knows that, well, that's just not true. Only 25% of kids are using by the end of 8th grade alcohol anyway. That's powerful knowledge for kids. So talk early, talk often, arm kids with evidence, arm kids with information, and not just, the things we've typically used, which is scare tactics and just say no, which don't work. Those tactics don't work at all.
So in your book, which is kind of the guide for parents, as I understand it, and can you share a couple of examples, practical examples of the kinds of conversation starters you have with an 8th grader or a 10th grader?
Actually, so one of the things I learned in my first book, The Gift of Failure, is that parents wanted specifics. They wanted like scripts for how to say difficult things. And so I was like, cool, with the second book, if people are asking me for more scripts from Gift of Failure, I'll give them more scripts in the addiction inoculation. So substance use prevention starts really early. It starts with preschool or kindergarten. And so I give scripts from preschool and kindergarten all the way up. And, preschool and kindergarten, we're not talking about, cocaine or methamphetamine use. We're talking about really practical things like why we don't swallow the toothpaste, why we spit it out, why that prescription bottle on the counter has one person's name on it and one person's name only. And what would, can another person take that? And what would happen if another person took that? And why we don't take things that don't have our names on them. And then that moves up developmentally as kids get older. Not only are there scripts for parents in there, because I know these are really scary conversations, there's scripts in there for ways kids can build their refusal skills. Like if, let's say, they're going to a party and they want to be able to not use without looking like a total dork, there's 2.5 pages of really realistic excuses that kids can use for why they can't have a drink or a drug or whatever that evening, all of which are, as I said, totally evidence-based, practical, real, or maybe just stretching the truth a little. And, the best of all, from my perspective, tends to be fine. Just throw me under the bus and say, I'm sorry, but my parents breathalyzed, my parents drug test, that kind of stuff. But there's a whole bunch of good reasons. Like, I have I get migraines. Well, alcohol is a big trigger for migraines. I can't eat gluten. That's very trendy right now. Well, it turns out most beer has gluten in it, so got to avoid that. If you're of Asian descent, there's a flushing syndrome that happens in people of Asian descent when they have alcohol. Many people with Asian descent when they have alcohol. So there's all kinds of really great reasons that are face-saving ways that kids can say no. And I have to say that was one of my favorite parts to write, because I talked to lots of kids about ways that they could say no and not look like a big dork.
And they want to, and yeah, they're going to be the exception, the kids who are going to sneak and who aren't going to use these ideas. The majority, having been a therapist and having many teens walk into my office over 40 years,
Mm-hmm.
they would like breathe a sigh of relief if you as a parent help them save face and not feel kind of dorky, and at the same time steer away from that. I actually was the only kid, now this is going back many years into the 70s, but I remember having friends who were tripping on acid and I wasn't, and I would just hang out with them as the only, and so somehow inside of me there had been something that felt sturdy enough that I was okay having them think whatever they thought.
Mm-hmm. I liked being, for myself, I didn't drink or use drugs as a kid, really, maybe every once in a while. And so I was always the designated driver. I was always the hold your hair back, kind of, and help you barf in the bushes kind of person. And, at the time, I liked being the reliable one. I liked being the one people could count on. So that worked for me as a teenager. But there's all kinds of ways that you can work this out. And, the thing for me, the thing that I was surprised over and over and over again in reading the research on, if it's just, the actual numbers of kids that use, how overblown and normalized use, drug and alcohol use is in the media, and that messes with our perception of how many kids use. And I wasn't even going to put a college chapter in the book because I figured, alcohol and college, they just go together. It turns out that's not true either. It's, in fact, so few people drink in college. I couldn't believe it. And then the statistics, actually, when you break the statistics down, it's a very, very narrow and very predictable, by the way, sliver of the college population that drinks. And if you can look at your kid and say, okay, well, if I'm objective and realistic about my own child and my own child's risk factors, then that's really useful information. And that helps you target your sort of preventions based on what kind of kid you have. So, not all kids are the same, and not all kids are going to have the same risk level, and not all kids are going to have react to the same sort of preventions. But my kids are at high risk. So I didn't have a lot of time to sort of pretend they weren't and not talk about it. So we talk about it fairly incessantly around here. And I can tell you, and you know this, the more often we have difficult conversations, the less difficult those conversations become.
Yeah. The first time it's like, the second time it might be the eye roll, like we already talked about that. And then eventually it's like, okay, yeah.
So these conversations may be easy for me because I do them all the time, but I still rely on Peggy Orenstein's book, Girls and Sex and Boys and Sex, to have the sex conversations. So it's not like all conversations are easy for me, but because we have this drug and alcohol conversation all the time from all different perspectives, it's just become a thing that we just talk about. It's not loaded at all. So that's been really great.
And you write about that a lot. Can you share a little bit of how it's been for you with your teenagers, how you've brought it up, or the kinds of things that volley back and forth?
So there's a lot of different, I'm raising my kids differently. I have now they're 22 and 18. The 22-year-old was raised in a more permissive household where he was allowed sips, he was allowed his own small glass of wine, that kind of thing. And the research is really clear that parents with a clear and consistent message of no, not until it's legal for you, which for me is less important. The legality, while is very important, is less important to me than the completion of brain development. So, the adolescent brain is not done developing into the early to mid 20s. And so the closer we can get them to that age group, the more time their brain has had to develop without being impeded by chemicals and stuff like that really do take a big toll on certain areas of brain development. And by the way, not reversible. Like you can't get them to 25 and then go back and like patch up the things that didn't get developed. You sort of, it happens and then the door kind of closes. So when I found that out, my now 18-year-old, he thinks this is so unfair. You know, our message with him is clear and consistent message of no, not until it is legal for you. And that's because he knows what I know. We talk about our work and we talk about stuff like this with our kids all the time. So if I were to do anything other than have a clear and consistent message of no, not until it's legal for you, it would be like me saying, I have information on how to be the best possible parent when it comes to drug and alcohol use, but I'm going to do it this way because I want you to like me, or because it's easier for me, or because it's just less complicated. And that, that's modeling. That's not the kind of modeling I want to do for my kids. So when he sees me doing the harder thing, the thing that makes me less popular, the thing that makes me less cool, he also knows I'm doing that because I'm doing that from a place of the best possible evidence, given that I want my kid to grow up and have a brain that's free to develop. And I want him to lower, I want to lower his risk of substance use disorder as low as I can, because he also knows what it was like for me to be an alcoholic and to be in recovery. And he knows that it's hard, and I don't want them to have to go through that. So all of that is in the conversations that we have. It's all coming from a place of love and respect and evidence.
That's such a cornerstone of how I work with parents. This idea that to do the job properly or right, or as it is needed, we cannot be led by a desire to be liked or popular with our children. They're incompatible.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean we don't wish that were otherwise. And it's great when we can say or do something for our kids and they go, man, you're the best. But it's not part of the job description, in my opinion. There's a different role that we have to play in that. So could you say a couple of things? And I know I really urge people to get the book, The Addiction Inoculation. But if you could just say a couple of things to get people's attention about the impact on a developing brain.
Sure. So the cool thing about the adolescent brain is, it's in this, there's two periods, as you well know, there's two periods in a human life where the most changes and the most, the brain is so exquisitely susceptible to what's going on in the environment and what we put in our bodies. And that's 0 to 2 and, puberty to, the early 20s. So in the same way that I wouldn't drink while I'm pregnant and I wouldn't let my 0 to 2-year-old drink, I'm also not going to let my adolescent drink, because we know, for example, that when drinking has a massive effect on the adolescent brain, not only in the fact that it makes things more dangerous for them in the short run. Adolescents are less likely to feel as drunk as an adult would if they have the same amount of alcohol in them. And they're also less likely to sort of suffer the negative after effects. So there's less of that negative feedback loop, about drinking. But if they're not feeling the effects as much as someone else, an adult might, they're also more likely to take risks like drive while drinking, that kind of thing. So there's that. There's the fact that the way adolescents tend to drink is binge drinking, and that's also really, really dangerous. But then with other drugs, something that might be low to moderate risk in an adult, fully formed, completed brain can be a moderate to high risk in an adolescent brain. For example, in kids who are chronic, I guess pun intended, chronic users of marijuana, they have smaller hippocampuses than kids who don't use marijuana. And that's because the receptors for the active ingredients, the things that make you high in cannabis, are located around the hippocampus. And so it clogs up those receptors, and it keeps things busy, messes with memory formation. And so that, that stereotype of the stoner with no short-term memory, well, that's because it's messing with your hippocampus. And a study came out just, about 6 months ago, showing actually thinning in the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of our brain where we do all the adulting, all that stuff that you get frustrated with your kid about not being able to do, like time management and starting and stopping and transitions and managing their time and their goals and all that stuff. That's prefrontal cortex work. And we know that cannabis thins the prefrontal cortex in developing teen brains. But I think it's also just really important, and I tried to make this part of the book as fun as possible, is understanding, what's going on in the brain and just how delicate it is during adolescence. It's what we call plastic. It's the environment and the things around a kid just makes a huge impact on how the brain develops. And so the longer we can keep kids away from substances, not only are we lowering their lifelong risk of ending up with substance use disorder, we're also protecting their brains for as long as possible, so their brains can be as healthy and well developed as possible.
This is such a hugely important thing that you're sharing and talking about, and really glad that you included pot, because a lot of people, especially if they were smokers in their own adolescence, have really downplayed the sort of the inevitability, or they've accepted the inevitability, or they imagine that it's inevitable, and they've downplayed the impact. For one thing, the pot that's circulating now, as I understand it, is a drug different from what, at least for me in the 70s, what I would have been used to, right?
It's a lot stronger than the skunk weed that, of the 70s. And, the other issue is that it's so much, the way you can ingest it is just so much more concentrated. And, especially since teenagers in particular tend to love edibles. Well, I guess, it's a really easy way to take it in. The problem is when you're taking an edible is not the same thing as smoking. It gets into your system a lot slower when it's going through your digestive tract. And so there's a lot higher risk of just taking a lot of it, thinking it's not hitting. And so you take more. But the real problem is that you also have to think about the stuff that's supposed to be happening in the adolescent brain and how absolutely 100% normal it is. So for example, the adolescent brain has lower baseline levels of dopamine than a child's brain or an adult's brain. So to teenagers, when they say I'm bored, that's not just lack of imagination. It's not because your teenager needs to just get up and go outside and play. It's because their brain is they're supposed to be seeking out novelty. They're supposed to be seeking out things that are new and different, because that's the purpose of adolescence, is to create more competent humans. And the way we do that is by seeking out new things. So the key thing so drugs and alcohol are particularly attractive because they allow you to see the world in new and different ways, whether that's a psychedelic or whether that's pot or whatever. So our job as parents is to know that our kids need more novelty. And we used to say risk, but that's really not accurate. It's just that novel things tend to often carry more risk. And so we need to push them towards positive risk. And this really was pointed out to me by Dan Siegel. I was on the phone with him and we were talking about, I put my younger kid in a position of not only does he have genetic risk, and by the way, genetics is about 50 to 60% of the risk picture. So my kids are already just from the get-go at higher risk than most kids. And on top of that, transitions are a really risky time for kids, especially between middle school and high school. And so we moved my already genetically at high risk kid to a whole new place in a whole new state with nobody he knew in between middle school and high school. And I was ranting about this with Dan Siegel and feeling all guilty and horrible about it. And Dan just did what Dan does, which is he said, well, Jess, you could think about it that way. You could be worried about all that risk. You could feel terrible about all that risk you put on your kid, or you could reframe it and you could say, a move is a time of unbelievable opportunities for positive risk, finding your way around a new place, meeting new people, trying new things. And it was like, I thought I was pretty good at reframing. I mean, I talk about reframing all the time with adolescents. And there I was realizing that I was doing my kid a huge disservice by portraying this entire move as part of his risk picture, when actually it was a really important part of his protective factors. And thank you, Dan Siegel, again, for turning that upside. I talk about that in the book. It was a blind spot for me, and it's helped. Doing all this research has not only helped my kids think about their lives and their risk and their brains in a different way. It's also helped me be a better role model and a better, reframer for my own kids.
That's such a great story. We're doing a class tomorrow, actually. By the time this airs, it may have happened, but it'll still be available. But I love that we can turn our kids on to more information about their brain because they are interested. And that is such an incredible access pathway to talking about some of this stuff, to really get into the geeky, cool science of how the brain is developing and what each area does, and why even things that might seem so benign like pot really have a long-term impact. So
well, and teaching kids about how their brain works is important for a number of reasons. And as someone, when we're not in a pandemic, I'm on the road a lot and I'm in schools a lot. And there are schools that are now teaching kids about the difference between their lower brain function and their higher brain functions from kindergarten on, so that a kid can understand, oh, when I got mad at that kid sitting next to me and hit him, that was my amygdala. That was my lower part of the brain. I mean, they're teaching little kids. I have this photograph of all of the pictures of the kids in the classroom with pictures of a brain sort of superimposed on top of that. And they talk about what things they do and what part of the brain they're operating from. So if they're thinking about how am I going to remember to do my homework tonight, that's upper brain stuff. And when they're thinking about reacting to something, that's lower brain stuff. So and also, knowing what we know about Carol Dweck's work and mindsets and fixed and growth mindsets, the more kids understand how learning works, how the brain works, how they can try to be their very best selves by operating from a place less of reacting and more of thinking, the more they feel a sense of control and self-efficacy about their own behavior. I mean, that's so powerful. Self-efficacy is one of the most powerful things we can help build for kids. And I can tell you right now, the kids in my rehab classroom, no matter what socioeconomic level they came from, no matter how much support they had, a lack of self-efficacy was the common denominator among these kids.
Yeah, William Stixrud and Ed Johnson, they're great book, The Self-Driven Child. They talk a lot about agency, and it's sort of all falls into that same umbrella. So
their new book is fantastic too. The What to Say book. I love it so much. I'm such a huge fan.
We did a class together too, and I'm like hanging on every word. When I got the book, I was just, I'm just going to basically highlight every sentence. And well,
it was great. Ned came to a book signing and a speaking event of mine for The Gift of Failure, and he said his name, and I said, wait, I have your book. It's at the hotel. I read it on the plane. And so we had sort of a mutual admiration society that evening. It was really, really fun. I'm a big fan of Ned.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you for your way of presenting, your heart, your clarity, the comprehensiveness of what you're sharing with parents, and the why behind it all. Is there anything
that's the key stuff, the why? I mean, kids all the time, and we know that the prevention science that works is all about helping kids understand the why. If we tell them, if we say dumb things like, drugs are bad, well, that doesn't make any sense. Why would people do drugs if drugs are all bad? Exactly. And if we get to the reality of, well, a lot of kids use drugs and alcohol because they have psychic, emotional, whatever pain that they are treating themselves. Yeah. And if we can just get at if we can make it so the kids feel like they belong, like they deserve to take up space in the world, they deserve to be loved, they deserve to be accepted for who they are, then we are not going to end up in a situation where they feel like they need to get liquid courage or powdered courage or smoke courage other places. And, as I mentioned in the book, and I quote Chris Herron, we tend to talk a lot about last use, like the last night I got really drunk, blackout drunk was really ugly. And is that entertaining? Yeah, I guess. But what is more important to me and more interesting to me is why I felt the need to drink in the first place. And that's because I had massive anxiety, and alcohol helped in the short term. Alcohol helped with my anxiety. Did it exacerbate my anxiety over the long term? Oh, you betcha. But in the beginning, it helped. And if someone had helped me with my anxiety so that I had an option other than to start ramping up my drinking. And the same thing goes for kids. If we can help them feel supported and loved, and like they have self-efficacy and like they have some agency and control in they'll have less of a need to turn to other things to feel like they have those things.
Yeah. And a big part of that means educating ourselves so that we are a
Absolutely.
safe place for our kids to come to, because it may be that we're talking about prevention here, but there are plenty of parents who are listening whose kids are already dabbling or using, and we want to be
Mhm.
the one that they know without question it's safe to come to, as opposed to the last person who they want to confide
Right.
in.
Right. And actually on that note, so my expertise is in prevention science. But lots and lots of people ask me the next question, which is, so what do I do if I think my kid is using? What do I do if I'm worried and maybe I feel like it's slid from use into abuse? I always recommend Dr. Joseph Lee, his book, Recovering My Kid. Dr. Lee is the head of adolescent services at Hazelton, Betty Ford Hazelton. And his book, Recovering My Kid, is just wonderful. It's a really great resource for parents whose adolescents are using, and that they need to start thinking about what the next steps are.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely.
Please let people know how to find you, and anything about the book that they should particularly keep their eye out for, or any resources that you want to point them toward.
So everything is at jessicalahey.com. And if you sign up there, or if you go to my Twitter handle, which is at Jess Lahey, I also have a newsletter you can sign up for there. And I put out newsletters, I put out bonus materials, I have bibliographies, I have recommendations, and I answer in my newsletter. One of the things I do is answer reader questions. I try to answer one email a day. At the end of the day, every single day before I go to sleep, the last thing I do is I answer a reader email, and I'm way behind. So I try to answer those in the newsletter so that they can benefit more people, and not just the one person I'm sending the email to. So everything is at jessicalahey.com.
And again, the book is The Addiction Inoculation.
Yep. Raising Healthy Kids in a Culture of Dependence.
Oof. Run, don't walk to get the book. Really, it belongs next to every parent's bedside.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Thank you so much, Jessica, for joining me and
such an honor.
magnifying the message. So grateful.
Thanks.